on that for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reporter Wrong. All right, we're going to move on to oil and gas.
Yeah, sure. Thank you all for having me. So my name is Greg Upton. I'm Associate Research Professor at the Center for Energy Studies at LSU. For those of you that might not be familiar with the center, so we were actually created in 1982 by the legislature. And when talking with members that were there at the time who were part of the creation of the center, kind of the story we're told, and it's really going to be interwoven into what I'm talking about, the history of mineral revenues today, is that when you go back to the 1970s, 1980s, over 40% of the tax collections in some years were mineral revenues. Just think about that, over 40%. That didn't include the sales taxes that the companies were paying. It didn't include the income taxes, the corporate income taxes, all the other taxes associated with it. That was just that direct piece. And so what the legislature said at the time is they had different groups coming to the legislature, testifying on different topics. And at some point, the members said, look, we just don't know what to believe, right? Some of these perspectives that are being brought can just not simultaneously be true. So what we do is we research what's going on in the energy industry. We research the environment and the Louisiana economy. And we try to present that research not only to you, but also to the general public, etc. So what I'm going to focus on today is the work that we've done over these past several years on mineral revenues. So I'm going to start off with the history, and then I'm going to talk about Louisiana's severance tax structure. And then I've got tons of extra slides in there that we can dig into the details that you guys might be interested in. And I've also provided you, each one of you, printed copies of two things. Number one is this mineral revenues report, which I'll talk about, that was produced in 2020. And then also our most recent was just released the week before Thanksgiving, our yearly energy outlook that really talks about, it's kind of outside of severance tax particularly or specifically, but talks about what's going on in the energy industry here and how that impacts our state. So let's dig into the history. Oh, and by the way, if you have any questions, any clarifying questions, you of course feel free to ask at any time. Kind of the natural points for questions will be at the end of the history and then with the severance tax structure. Okay. So this right here, this figure is one that we update over time, and it shows the green line is total state revenues. And when I say total state revenues, this means the TLF, taxes, licenses, and fees, as defined by the Revenue Estimating Conference. And so there you can see the green line there. It goes up over time, of course, naturally, of course, as inflation happens. That's naturally going to occur. The orange line there at the bottom is mineral revenues. And so you can kind of see how that's gone up and down over time. But what's perhaps most notable is that mineral revenues is a share of the total state revenues. And mineral revenues here, it includes severance taxes, but it also includes royalties for production on state lands and water bottoms. And so again, as I mentioned, if you go back to the 1970s and the 1980s, over 40% of the state's revenues in some years came up from severance tax. In fact, if you go back to the 1960s, in 1 year there was over 50%. And that's as far back as we can get a consistent picture here. Some of that was due to tax changes. So like, for instance, in 1973, 1974, there were some changes to the oil and gas tax structure and also equivalent changes made to the tax base for sales tax. But overall, these fluctuations that you're seeing are really coming from commodity price swings as well as production. If you go back to about about 1980, that's when the state reached its kind of peak oil production, and that started declining. And then, of course, through the 1980s, you had the oil price crash. And so the prices, dropped significantly. And now imagine a state that's getting over 40% of its revenues in 1982, coincidentally the year that the center was created. And all of a sudden, production starts declining, and the price drops precipitously. This put the state into... Really, they had to figure out how they were going to chart forward. So as I mentioned, in the 1980s, the price dropped significantly, and this persisted. And so in 1983, the Counselor for a Better Louisiana with encouragement from several legislators and executive departments at the time, created a special committee to study the state's financial situation. And this was done throughout the mid-1980s. And in 1988, a book entitled Louisiana's Fiscal Alternatives was published. And the chapter on severance taxes in here was written by Dr. Richardson, who was also the editor of the book, and also Dr. Lauren Scott. And so this really went through all of the taxes within the state. But of course, the big motivation for this study was that drop in the severance tax revenues and mineral revenues broadly that we just talked about. So now we fast forward to 2002. So the legislature passed the Stelly Plan, pioneered by Vic Stelly. And what the Stelly Plan did is it decreased sales taxes and increased income taxes. And we can get into the details of how if you like. I'm probably not the best person to talk to about that. But the bottom line is that you had Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. You had high commodity prices at the time. And in 2008, tax receipts were up significantly due to this. And you can see that in the charts over to the right that shows taxes, licenses, and fees as a share of gross state product and personal income. And you can see that they were up significantly. Then the legislature decided to decrease income taxes similar to the pre-Stelly levels, partially in 2007 and partially in 2008. So then, of course, what happens after that tax decrease? You have commodity prices drop. And you also have the kind of post-hurricane boom that occurred here in Louisiana subsided. And of course, this again put the state into a difficult financial situation. So when Governor Edwards was elected, he created, or a task force was created from HCR 11 that created the Task Force on Structural Changes in Budget and Tax Policy. And so part of the stuff I'll be presenting today was presented to that task force at the time that I presented to them. Dr. Richardson and Secretary Kim Lewis, who was at the time the Secretary of the Department of Revenue, served as co-chairs of that task force. The final report was published in 2017. And then in 2018, a book was published that I've got right here and is also up there that was kind of an update to the book published in the 1980s. And so in this book right here, which you could all gain a copy of, there's a chapter on severance tax revenues that I'm the author of, that again, some of this will be pulled from that I'll be talking about today. Okay. So at the time, though, commodity prices were down. There was really not a big appetite to make big changes to severance tax structure at the time. So then in 2018, Senate Concurrent Resolution 4 of the second special session was passed. This was by Senator Allan. And really, Senator Allan requested the Center for Energy Studies and the Public Administration Institute, so essentially myself and Dr. Richardson, to do a 3-year deep dive on severance taxes. And so in year one, we were tasked with meeting with stakeholders, and we met with every stakeholder under the sun you can imagine. In year two, we then conducted analysis and submitted a final written report with recommendations. That report right here is Mineral Revenues in Louisiana, which each of you has been provided, which dives into the severance taxes and the history, etc. And then in year three, we were to provide specific bills implementing recommendations by early 2021. And that is exactly what we did. So in January of 2021, the report and recommendations were then presented to, we had a joint House Ways and Means and Senate Revenue and Fiscal Affairs, and I see Representative Orgeron and others here today that were there at that time, where we really dug into not just the severance tax structure, but what were the recommendations based upon the items that we were asked to talk about. So today, I'm not really going to get into those recommendations. Of course, I'm happy to talk about them if you're interested, but really I'm going to focus on the part of the report that's just the kind of severance tax 101. What does our tax structure look like? Okay. This right here, I just kind of threw in here and this is based upon our most recent Gulf Coast Energy Outlook that we just released the week before Thanksgiving. It's a yearly outlook that we do that shows oil and gas employment in Louisiana. So this is upstream oil and gas extraction and services sectors. And as you can see, pre-2015, we had about 50,000 workers in those sectors, and kind of bounced up and down with the price, of course. It's not shown here, but if you go back to the 1970s, we had over 100,000 workers in these sectors in kind of those peak years. We lost about 20,000 jobs in these sectors when the 2014-2015 price crash happened. That was really difficult for the state, as you can imagine. In fact, the U.S. economy was still expanding while Louisiana actually went into a little recession at the time. My personal opinion induced by this. Then we started gaining some of those jobs back, but definitely didn't get anywhere near the pre-2014 levels. And then, of course, you had the COVID-19 pandemic. Prices again fell, and we lost about 8,700 jobs again in those sectors. To date, we've gained back about 2,500 of those jobs, but we're not anywhere near the pre-COVID, much less the pre-2014 peak. Our forecast is projecting that we'll gain about 3,500 of those jobs back by mid next year, but that we're not likely going to enter back to that pre-pandemic peak, much less the pre-2015 peak. So that's kind of, again, not the focus of today, but I just kind of wanted to give some backdrop of where is this part of the industry today relative to historically. We could talk about it later, but there's a very different story when you look at energy manufacturing, refining, chemical manufacturing, plastics. Employment in those sectors has actually grown over this time period. So this is just this isn't the entirety of the energy sector in our state, which is much larger. This is just that upstream oil and gas extraction and services piece. Okay. So are there any questions on that before the history before I dig into the severance tax structure?
Rep. Willard?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Quick question. Is that trajectory similar to other oil and gas states or consistent with the U.S. trajectory going from, I guess, 2014 to present day?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we actually, in our outlook, we also forecast employment in Texas, and upstream oil and gas employment in Texas. It's a similar projection in that
I know the numbers aren't the same, but percentage-wise, is it consistent?
Yeah, so it is. So it's actually interesting because you see that Texas oil and gas extraction and services employment fluctuates way more than in Louisiana.
Okay.
And that's in the booms and the busts. And a lot of the reason for that is that Louisiana employment in those sectors has increasingly moved to offshore production. And that offshore, federal waters, it doesn't enter into our severance tax base that we'll talk about today. But those jobs, I think, are more long-term in nature. Companies are thinking 10 years out. They're not moving up and down with the price fluctuations. So yes, employment in those sectors today is lower than it was historically, and candidly likely will be into the future as we have efficiency gains. So if you think about agricultural employment in the United States, going back to the early 1900s, we had a very large share of our employment was in those agricultural sectors. Why isn't that the case today? Well, we have big machinery and capital that's used to produce those things. And so in terms of looking forward, of course, no one knows what's going to happen. But my projection is that Louisiana will never enter into employment levels in those sectors as we saw historically. Even if production were to increase precipitously, I don't think we would see those employment.
And that's largely due to advancements in technology and processing equipment and stuff like that?
That's absolutely correct, yes. In fact, natural gas production today has been rising significantly over the past several years. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rep. Willard. And just for clarification, he always asks great questions. Rep. Boyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a follow-up, a clarification on Rep. Willard's question. The similarity between the oil and producing states, the same ebbs and flows that you expect from the trend standpoint, is that historical also, that since 2014 that other oil producing states saw the same drop off as Louisiana? Or is that
Oh yeah, no,
past?
Texas absolutely was significantly negatively impacted in the oil price drop.
Okay, great.
If you look at North Dakota, very similar. You go up to Pennsylvania, they were a more gassy area, and therefore they didn't have the drop off whenever oil prices dropped. But you go a few years before that when natural gas prices dropped, and again they experienced those ebbs and flows.
And when they haven't ebbed and flowed any differently than us that you could see since 2014. It's all been pretty similar.
It has. What I would note is that in other parts of the country where they have these shale plays, they have seen increases in employment with those when the prices rise. Louisiana honestly has not. And a lot of that reason is because we just don't have those shale plays. We have the Haynesville up in North Louisiana. And those shale plays, because of their very nature, are more boom-bust oriented. We are really concentrated, increasingly so today, in that offshore oil and gas production, which is a positive part of that is I think it's going to be less volatile moving forward into the future.
So when you mentioned the offshore production from a historical standpoint, what can you just for the committee explain to everybody what constitutes offshore and how that maybe came to be?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, so if you go back to the late 1800s, I believe, there was a debate over, how far out water was considered state water versus federal water. And an interesting kind of story is that Louisiana only has 3 miles offshore, while our neighbor Texas has 9 miles offshore. And the historical reason I've been told for this, and Mr. Bauman, who here probably has way more history on this, but at the time, Texas had a navy, and they could conceivably protect 9 miles offshore, but Louisiana didn't. So one asked, well, how far could you conceivably shoot a cannonball? And the answer was probably about 3 miles. And so to this day, we only receive revenues from production 3 miles off our shore, while Texas actually receives it 9 miles off our shore. But to answer your question, once you go past 3 miles, that then enters into federal waters, in which those royalties are going to be paid to the federal government, not to the state of Louisiana.
That does sound like a story that Mr. Bauman probably had told to you at one time or another. Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Oye. Rep. Willard?
Just quickly, so Texas gets revenues up to 9 miles out, and we get up to 3 miles out?
That's accurate.
Is there anything the state legislature can do to change that?
I don't believe so. I think that would have to be
think
federal legislation.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Rep. Willard. So when you look at the history of the collections for Louisiana, and I think around 66 was when your slide had started, and then today, is the product still there, or it's been depleted so much? I mean, what went on from 66 to present day? I know we talked about the cannonball and stuff, but
So oil production in the state, and that's on state lands and waters, has decreased significantly. In fact, it's in the mineral revenues report. You have it. I don't have a slide with it, but it has gone a very, very, very long and steady decline curve. Of course, it might, go up a little bit with the price, but that kind of long, steady decline curve. A lot of that production has moved offshore. And if you look in the 1990s and the 2000s, offshore oil production was increasing over that time period. And so what you saw for oil was kind of a shift further offshore as technology advanced. And what that did, it moved that production out of state jurisdiction into those federal jurisdictions. When you look at natural gas production today, you actually see a different story. And that is that natural gas production has been increasing year over year over the past several years because of the Haynesville Shale up in northwest Louisiana. And so you see starkly different stories if you think about oil and natural gas in terms of the state itself.
okay. And looking at the employment forecast and when it fell, and I know you're saying in 2023 y'all expect it to go back up by about 3,500 jobs. Is that based off of the production, or is it based off of the price of oil and gas? What do you anticipate that increase in jobs?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this is how our models work. We take a model which is called the Inveris Prodcast model, and that's a geological based model. So they take every single really field in the entire United States and they aggregate them into larger reservoirs, and then they say, well, what is the break-even price for drilling new wells and increasing production out of this? And then they merge that with futures markets data, which the futures market is an unbiased estimate of what the market believes the price will be in the future. And then they get what's called a production forecast. And so we call that our Prodcast production forecast model. We then merge that with the futures prices that I just mentioned, in order to get the value of production. So you take price times quantity, and then we aggregate that up into the Gulf Coast region because we're really one cohesive labor market. And then we use statistical models that model the relationship between previous fluctuations in the value of production and employment. And then we forecast out production for Texas and Louisiana as a whole. And then we have models that then allocate that out between the two states. And so it's a statistical model. Then what I do is I then show that model to probably 30, 40 people from industry. And then I ask them like, hey, is this what you're seeing? And I make about 100 phone calls in the 2 months leading up to the Energy Outlook. In fact, I talk with Representative Orgeron each year. And then I will adjust the forecast based upon what I'm hearing. This year, it was actually interesting. Everyone from industry told me, no, that forecast looks completely reasonable based on the statistical model, and there was actually no ex post adjustment.
Mm-hmm. I have one other question for you. And for my time here, I've heard a lot about dynamic scoring and things of that nature, and if it works. But I've never actually met anybody that did dynamic scoring. Have you ever done dynamic scoring?
I have. In fact, the last 50 pages of your packet here is all dynamic scoring details, and so I would just love to spend the whole day nerding out on it with you if you're so inclined. Nothing would make me more excited. But yes, I can absolutely talk to you about that.
Thank you, Dr. Upton. Rep. Fornham?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's hard to imagine you more excited than you are right now.
Oh, well, thank you.
So do y'all have a breakdown on the number of rigs that are inside the 3 mile line and outside, and how that number has changed since 2014? Has there been a movement to push the rigs further out to get outside of the state waters?
So my understanding, and actually Representative Orgeron would probably be able to say this better than I, is that those are very different rigs. So the rigs that we're using in inland waters and state waters are going to be fundamentally different rigs than what's used in federal deep offshore. You could think of like really on that margin of like, okay, you're at 2.8 miles versus 3.2 miles or something. Yeah, sure, you could use the same one. But really these longer term trends are talking about deep water, big producing platforms. It's just really different technology. But yeah, we could definitely give you a rig count. DNR has it.
Yeah, and has there been a movement, a trend that changes the number of rigs that are out there? And has the limitation on drilling in the past several years changed any of that? The ban on new oil rigs and things of that nature. The other question I have is, how does the severance tax differ from state waters to federal waters? I mean, we have 12-point-something% severance tax, and how does that differ from the federal waters?
Okay, so to start with your first question, the federal changes to drilling offshore, these have certainly had an impact. So whenever President Biden was elected, his first executive order came out, and it said that that we were going to discontinue oil and gas leasing on federal lands and waters. And if you look at page 11 of the Energy Outlook, there is a timeline that says exactly each of these steps of what occurred. So at that point, the different states and companies sued the federal government, and they said, "Hey, you can't do this. Congress authorized these lease sales." And the executive branch just can't state via executive order that it's not going to fulfill its duties as an executive branch. And this went through the courts. The courts tended to actually agree with these critiques. Mm-hmm. So they did go forward with what's called Lease Sale 257 last November, and it was a successful lease sale. 81 million acres were leased. $192 million of revenues came to the federal government. But then, again, that went through the courts, and the lease sale was actually vacated in a federal court in Washington, D.C. Again, this created an enormous amount of backlash. Can we do this? And so there was, really debate back and forth. When the Inflation Reduction Act was being debated, you had, Joe Manchin, you had some of the Republican Democrats in the House from oil and gas states such as Texas that were impacted by these legal actions, And really, so what happened is they were able to move into the Inflation Reduction Act that for the next 10 years, oil and gas leasing will continue. Lease sale 257, which was vacated, is actually back on the books moving forward. And interestingly, that the federal government can't do a federal lease sale for wind unless it also does a lease sale for oil and gas within so many days. So there were some, measures in there. So at this point, our employment forecasts are assuming that federal leasing continues. But of course, what legally happens in the future, we can't project. But that's what our forecasts are projecting.
Okay, I got one last question.
Yeah.
How does the mileage from the coast differ from Texas is 9, Louisiana's 3, and production along the entire Gulf Coast? Does Mississippi and Alabama and Florida have rigs along their coastlines, or how do we differ from those other Gulf Coast states?
Louisiana is ground zero for offshore oil and gas operations. So a lot of the white collar jobs are in Houston, candidly. But in terms of the actual operations, they're based here in South Louisiana. And the reason for that is that's where the hydrocarbons are. So yeah, they've got a little bit in Mississippi. I don't think anything, maybe a few wells in Alabama drilled. They have a few.
Is it primarily west of the Mississippi?
Yeah, kind of down the toe of the boot, but it even goes into the deep stuff, yes, but you go over to western Louisiana, and there's a lot of operations out there as well. So yeah, no, but for offshore, Louisiana is definitely ground zero.
Wow.
Prohibition in Florida.
Okay, well, I appreciate your passion for this subject because it is extremely vital to our state. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rep. Farnham. Just so the members of the committee know, Dr. Upton is very good at killing bills too. Trust me.
Thank you, Representative Dill. Yeah, appreciate that.
Okay, we can move. No further questions.
All right. So let's move into what the actual severance tax structure is at this point. So this is going to be what I'm presenting here is Section 4 out of, again, this mineral revenues in Louisiana that I provided you. I'm going to hit, again, the very 30,000 foot level pieces of it. Okay. So what is a severance tax rate? Louisiana has the highest severance tax rate for oil of any state in the continental United States. So that is 12.5% of its value at the time and place of severance. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit more detailed on the next slide. Louisiana, though, has a relatively low tax rate for natural gas, approximately 4%. Again, we'll get into the details of how that valuation works here in a second. For comparison, actually, interestingly, Texas taxes oil at 4.6% and natural gas at 7.5%. But they're actually unique with Louisiana of taxing them at different rates. Arkansas and Mississippi both have a 5 and 6% rate for both, respectively. Most states have either the same tax rate for oil and gas or a very similar rate. So you might be asking, why, right? Why does Louisiana tax oil at 3 times the rate of natural gas? And so we dig into that, the economic why. Is there a good economic rationale for that within our mineral revenues report? But I want to provide you a little bit of history of how did that actually occur? So I have a letter here. So we have a energy library at the Center for Energy Studies. I was able to go pull these historical documents from. It's kind of fun. And this is a letter that was actually written by Mr. Baumann, who's here today. And this is a piece of it. He says, the Louisiana severance tax rate on oil is approximately 3 times that on natural gas. And by the way, this is from the letters from 2002 written to a member of the Board of Supervisors at LSU. Louisiana is the only state that has such a large difference in the severance tax on the 2 commodities. This is rooted in our history, and it's worthwhile to briefly review it. In the early 1970s, Governor Edwards doubled the oil severance tax to the current 12.5%. At the time, the price of oil was not market-based and was fixed, I believe, at $3. In doubling the severance tax, Edwards knew, which he only later revealed, that the United States was going to raise the fixed price by $1. Thus, the oil companies would pay another 24 cents or so in taxes, but they would gross another $1 per barrel in revenue. The Edwardian logic being that both the state and the oil companies came out ahead. In the same bill, it was also proposed to double the severance tax rate on natural gas from 7 to 14 cents. Back then, it was just a volumetric rate. Natural gas was also under price controls, but Louisiana consumed much of it. This led to the argument that the tax could not be passed through to out-of-state consumers, and this provision was therefore dropped, based on my conversations with Edward Edwards and Bob Brookshire. So it comes back again to this kind of historical events that happened. Louisiana is a big natural gas consuming state, not only for energy, but also in our chemical sector, uses that natural gas in a feedstock. And so this is the history of why it's there. Again, we dig into, is there economic logic for that today? I really don't think that there is, but this is the historical precedence for why that's the case.
Doc, would you mind getting the committee a copy of that letter just so that we could all have a copy of it?
I'm happy to. Absolutely.
Great.
All right, so now we're going to talk about, that's the rate. Now let's talk about how valuation occurs for tax purposes. So as I mentioned, Louisiana taxes oil at a rate of 12.5% of its value at the time and place of severance. This is the value. The value is the higher of the gross receipts received from the first purchaser, less transportation charges, which that's a whole other, we could discuss that for an hour just by itself, or the posted field price. So historically, what I'm told is that people use the posted field price. There was very little debate over this, and that's what they paid the tax upon. But posted field prices are no longer an industry practice today. And so now what people have to do is the gross receipts from the first purchaser less those transportation charges. And there have been legal disputes on this over the past several years. Avanti versus Robinson is one case if you want to look it up, and we could talk about it more. So Louisiana is unique in that natural gas is taxed at a volumetric rate that's adjusted to the Henry Hub natural gas price in the preceding year. So it doesn't matter what price you sold your natural gas for. There is a volumetric rate, and you will pay that volumetric rate, but that volumetric rate is updated every fiscal year based upon the market rate in the prior year. And so DNR calculates what that is. That's given to the Department of Revenue, and that's posted publicly for what that volumetric rate is. So Louisiana, along with North Dakota, we're unique in taxing natural gas at a volumetric rate indexed to a market price in the prior fiscal year. But Louisiana taxes oil similar to other states that's based upon the value at the time and place of severance. So the value-based severance is actually the more common than the volumetric. So again, you might say, oh my gosh, we tax oil at 3 times the rate of natural gas. Oil's valued at a value basis while natural gas is volumetric. Again, why did this happen? Is there economic logic for this today? Again, I don't think there is. We can, we dig into that in the report, but historically what happened, okay? And so what I've provided you here, and I can also provide this again from our energy library, but this was an old document, analysis of an indexed volume severance tax that was prepared for the Department of Natural Resources in 1989. And this is the description it gives. It says Mid-Continent, who at the time, today that's LaMoga, Louisiana Mid-Continent Oil and Gas Association. They represent the larger vertically integrated companies. They actually preferred an indexed volumetric approach, as we have for natural gas, for its simplicity of implementation, as opposed to the percent of value approach for its complexity and difficulty to implement. Okay? But keep in mind, these are the larger producers. They're vertically integrated. Perhaps they're better able to get a higher price for their product, so it might make sense that they want a volumetric rate. Contrarily, the Louisiana Association of Independent Producers and Royalty Owners, which is the modern-day LOGA, the Louisiana Oil and Gas Association, which really represents the smaller oil and gas producers, they were opposed to the index volumetric severance tax for its difficulty to implement and its unfairness to independent producers, citing equity to producers with different selling prices. So it's kind of interesting that they didn't necessarily disagree on the simplicity piece, but there was more the different selling price that was important there. So this actually ends up being an empirical question that we dig into, again, very detailed in the report. but again, we'll kind of skip over that. But that's the history of why we have this different valuation today. All right, now let's talk about exemptions. So one of the broad recommendations of the task force that I mentioned earlier was to keep rates as low as possible and the tax base as broad as possible. And so SCR4 tasked us with considering whether, again, we could lower rates and broad base. So we need to think about these exemptions. The horizontal drilling exemption is the most notable exemption in the state. We have a horizontal drilling exemption that's 100% of taxes owed for the first 2 years or until well payout, whichever occurs first. And there is a price cap on this where it is phased out. But we have a relatively generous horizontal drilling exemption, and Louisiana is very unique in this regard. Other states do not have a generous, or at least as generous, horizontal drilling exemption, and horizontal drilling today is really kind of the standard of what goes on in the industry. At the time that it was passed, it was not the standard. It was some technology that perhaps could have been economic into the future. We also have stripper and incapable well rates, and so these are reduced rates for wells that are kind of marginal producers here. And these are really common across states. A lot of states have reduced severance tax rates for these kind of marginal producing wells. So this is in your mineral revenues report, table 9.1. I updated it here to include the most recent 5 years of data. So I average 5 years to kind of average out fluctuations from year to year. But as you can see here is that over half of the potential severance taxes that could be received are exempt for natural gas, over half, because of that horizontal drilling exemption, while that's only about 16% for oil. And of the value of those exemptions for gas, over 91% of that is that horizontal drilling exemption. So if you talk about broad-based low rates, inevitably what you're talking about is scaling back on that horizontal drilling exemption, and inevitably, who's that going to impact? That's going to impact producers up in the Haynesville. So you can, have the academic discussion of, well, do we want broad-based low rates? What's a, tax structure that kind of makes sense? But the political reality is that making those changes impacts different one of your constituents very differently. And that's just that's the reality of it. So you can see that graphically here. So for natural gas, we have $158 million worth of exemptions on average over the past 5 years, while the average revenues from gas was only $138 million. For oil, you have $254 million in revenues and about $51 million in exemptions. So not only is the rate for oil way higher than natural gas, 3 times the rate, but also the exemptions way more heavily go towards natural gas. And so what do you end up with? You end up with natural gas in Louisiana is taxed at a very low rate relative to other states, and oil is taxed at a very high rate. And this shows you the historical value of state-imposed severance tax exemptions, and you can see the run-up here, which mirrors exactly when the run-up in the Haynesville Shale occurred. So this was, from a historical standpoint, way higher level of exemption than we had seen historically. Okay. So you might ask, okay, well in net, how does this come out? Is Louisiana a high tax state or a low tax state on average? And in order to get an idea of this, I pulled 2 different studies. So the first study over here on the left was published by the late Alan Pulsifer, who's executive director of the Center for Energy Studies. Mr. Bauman also, who was at the Center for Energy Studies at the time, was a co-author on this. And what they did is they went and kind of created a representative well in all these different states. And then they changed the tax structure to see how it would impact the economics of it. And so what you see there is taxes per barrel equivalent. And so Louisiana is kind of right there in the middle. And that's when you take sales tax, corporate income tax, property tax, and severance tax all into account. So what do you get? Louisiana, again, is kind of in the middle of the pack, which is a good place to be for tax policy, right? You might not want the highest or the lowest taxes being in the middle of the pack. It makes you competitive, but also allows you to bring in revenues. You look on the right-hand side, this was a paper published by 2 colleagues at what's called Resources in the Future in Washington, D.C. Again, nothing to do with Louisiana. And what did they do? They only look at property taxes and severance taxes. And again, what do they find? that Louisiana is right in the middle of the pack. Of course, different states have different ways of receiving those revenues overall, but again, Louisiana is in the middle of the pack. So the bottom line is, on net, the tax burden is again in the middle of the pack, but oil is taxed way, way, way higher than gas, and so you see this big asymmetry there. Okay. So with that, that's the overview of the tax structure. I think we've gone longer than I anticipated. I apologize, but I'm happy to take any questions, and also happy to dig into any of the details that y'all might be interested in.
Dr. Upton, the board is clear. We do have one. Representative Willard.
I'll be quick. Thank you. On figure 9.1 with the line graph, it looks like around 2010 or so we have this huge peak, and I know you kind of hit it. You said that was with the rise of shale. Mm-hmm. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so when that happened, we were doing more horizontal drilling, which blew up that exemption. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
That was short and sweet. Thank you, Rep. Willard. Rep. DeVilliers.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Dr. Upton, how many orphan wells would you say we have in Louisiana?
About 4,500 right now, but that number is likely to increase. Louisiana is currently receiving an estimated about $100 million over the next several years from the infrastructure law to plug those orphan wells. And so part of that DNR is working on right now, and I could bring in Blake Canfield that can be the person to really talk about this, but likely they're going to be working on identifying all those orphan wells so that they can classify them as an orphan in order to be able to use those federal dollars in order to plug them. But right now it's about 4,500, I believe. In your research and the Institute's studies, as far as looking at orphan wells, and I hate to bring in stripper wells as well, mm-hmm. is there a potential to bring any of these wells back online and increase production to where they're more productive for the state? I think there is. I think the key here is the liability issues of moving into an old field that has orphans would be very difficult for a company to make that financial commitment. And so I think plugging those orphan wells can assist with that. I think the wells that you really would target that have the most likelihood of increasing production are those stripper wells that are low producing, or idle wells that recently became idle. And so, those, if you kind of think about those wells, you can say, okay, if you were to come up with some policy that really targeted those to allow people to go and focus and pull those into production, they're not going to be big producers. It's not going to be enormous amounts of money, but it would definitely be, those would be the ones to target to do what you're talking about. Is that in your recommendations? It is not, but it was not in the scope of what we were asked to do in SCR 4. So if that is something that you are interested in, Representative, I'd love to, assist you with putting that together. Okay. I'm just going to thank you for all of your hard work. I know I've left a few committee hearings on the Senate side where I was probably a little frustrated, but it is appreciated to see all the work that you put in and understand more about, when I bring a bill that focuses on one part, how does it look when you look at everything. So thank you for your work. Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Rep. DeVilliers. Rep. Willard, for another bite.
Quickly. Okay, so the horizontal drilling exemption, do you know when that was put into effect?
Yes, it's in the report. It's in the 1990s. It was well before anyone anticipated the industry moving in that direction.
It's been structured the same way since then?
There were changes 100%. Made in 20... Again, I can go look it up for you, but there were price caps put on it that changed the structure a little bit in terms of phasing it out when the price went above some level. But the overall structure of 2 years or until well payout for a horizontal well, yes, that's been consistent.
Okay. Thank you.
Dr. Upton, that clears the board. Thank you for your presentation today. It was very informative, very educational, and we appreciate your work, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you so much.